27 minutes. Margot Winslow checked the diamond-faced watch on her wrist again, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. The murmur of the upscale restaurant, the clinking of silver on porcelain, the soft jazz. It was all just noise, a grating soundtrack to a colossal waste of her time. She'd closed a 9-figure deal over the phone just an hour ago without breaking a sweat. Yet this man, this Matthew, her friend Clara had insisted was worth it, couldn't even manage to be on time. She signaled the waiter with a flick of her eyes. It was time to leave. This was a mistake. Just as she reached for her purse, the restaurant doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of chilly night air and a man with panic in his eyes. He wore a simple, slightly worn jacket. His hair was a mess, and he was breathing hard. It was an entrance utterly devoid of the power and precision she was accustomed to. But he wasn't alone. Clinging to his hand was a small girl with wide, worried eyes and 2 long brown braids. "I am so sorry," the man, Matthew, began, his voice a rushed, flustered apology. "My babysitter, she had an emergency, and I just—" He gestured vaguely, his eyes darting to his daughter, Sophie, clearly overwhelmed. Margot's gaze remained like ice. An excuse. They always had an excuse. She held up a hand, ready to cut him off, to dismiss him with a single, sharp sentence. This evening was over. But before she could speak, the little girl, Sophie, let go of her father's hand. She took 2 hesitant steps forward, her small shoes silent on the polished floor. She stopped beside Margot's chair, looking up at the powerful CEO with an expression of profound seriousness. The girl leaned in, her breath warm against Margot's ear, and her voice was a bare whisper, but the words she spoke would shatter Margot's perfectly curated world in a single, gut-wrenching heartbeat. "My daddy says my mommy became an angel when I was born," Sophie whispered, her small voice earnest and clear. "He says she has the prettiest eyes, just like yours, and she's watching over us from the brightest star in the sky." The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, childish and out of place in the sterile elegance of the restaurant. Then they landed. Not in her mind, but somewhere deeper, in a place she had sealed off with steel and concrete 8 years ago. A place where a different, tiny heartbeat had once echoed. The image hit her without warning. A sterile white room, the deafening silence after a single, weak cry. The weight of a dream turning to dust in her arms. The restaurant, the waiter, the man standing awkwardly by the table, it all dissolved. Her carefully constructed composure, the armor she wore every single day, cracked. A tremor started in her hands, a violent, uncontrollable shudder. She felt a burning sensation behind her eyes, a pressure she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Before she could stop it, a single, hot tear escaped, then another, carving silent, shocking paths down her cheeks. Matthew watched, frozen in a state of horrified confusion. His date, this impossibly elegant woman who looked like she could command armies with a single glance, was crying because of something his daughter said. He started to move, to apologize, to grab Sophie and run, but he was paralyzed. Sophie, however, was not. Seeing the tears, her small face filled with concern. She thought she'd made it worse. She leaned in again, her whisper even more urgent. "Please don't be mad at Daddy," she pleaded, her little hand touching Margot's sleeve. "He was late 'cause a man on the bus got sick." He was sleeping on the floor, and Daddy was pushing his chest and telling everyone not to be scared. "He's a hero. He just didn't want to tell you." Margot's head snapped up, her tear-filled eyes locked onto Matthew's. She saw him not as a tardy, disorganized stranger anymore, but as the man Sophie had just described. A man who helped a stranger and didn't even mention it. A man who told his daughter beautiful stories about her mother. The chaos of the last few minutes began to settle into a new, startling clarity. The foundation of her world, built on control and emotional detachment, was crumbling. "Sit down," she said, her voice raspy, barely recognizable to her own ears. It wasn't a request. It was a command, but the iciness was gone, replaced by a raw, fragile authority. Matthew, still reeling, pulled out a chair for Sophie before sinking into the one opposite Margot. The silence that fell between them was no longer hostile. It was heavy, thick with unspoken questions and the shared, invisible weight of profound loss. "What is your name?" Margot asked, her gaze unwavering, searching his face for something she couldn't define. "Matthew Stone," he answered quietly. "And this is Sophie." Sophie gave a small, hesitant wave. Margot nodded slowly, dabbing at her eyes with a linen napkin, the gesture foreign and clumsy. Margot Winslow. The name hung in the air. Matthew's blood ran cold. Winslow, as in Winslow Investments. The name emblazoned in giant silver letters across the top of the very building he cleaned every night. He was on a blind date with the CEO of the company where he mopped the floors. The absurdity of it was so immense, it was almost funny. Almost. Right now, it was terrifying. He felt a desperate urge to flee, to disappear back into the anonymity of his quiet life. But before he could formulate an escape, Margot's phone, sitting face down on the table, began to vibrate violently. A harsh, insistent buzz that cut through the fragile atmosphere. She glanced at the screen, and her entire demeanor shifted in an instant. The raw vulnerability vanished, replaced by a familiar, sharp-edged focus. The CEO was back. "I have to take this," she said, her voice clipped. She stood and walked a few feet away, turning her back to them. Her words were low but tense. "What do you mean, a breach? Which floor?" "No, that's impossible. Seal the entire network. Now." Matthew watched her, his heart pounding for a different reason now. He knew that building. He knew its sounds, its secrets, its flaws. He cleaned the executive floors. He knew the network rooms, and he knew something security didn't. Margot ended the call, her face pale. She turned back to the table, her mind clearly a million miles away, already calculating, strategizing. "I'm sorry, I have to go. There's a situation at my office." Matthew looked at her, then made a decision. He couldn't run. Not now. "The 48th floor," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Margot froze, her eyes narrowing. "What did you say?" "The breach," he clarified, leaning forward slightly. "It's on the 48th floor, isn't it? The East Wing server room." He saw the flicker of shock on her face and pressed on. "There's a faulty sensor on the fire escape access panel just outside it. I've reported it 3 times. It wouldn't register on the main security feed, but it leaves the external network port vulnerable for about 3 minutes after a manual reset." Margot stared at him, her mind racing to connect the dots. How could this man, this stranger, this janitor possibly know that? The security team hadn't said anything about a faulty sensor. They were scrambling, locking down the wrong sectors. This man, who had shown up late with his daughter, had just given her a piece of intelligence more valuable than anything her entire multi-million-dollar security apparatus had provided. The blind date had just become a crisis meeting, and the man she was about to dismiss might be the only person who could help her save her company. Margot's mind, trained to process information at lightning speed, struggled to keep up. The data points didn't align. The man in the worn jacket, the little girl with the story about an angel, the man who saved a stranger on a bus, and now, a security expert who knew about a sensor flaw her own tech team had missed. They were all the same person. "How?" she started, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes locked on his. "How do you know that?" Matthew's face flushed. The adrenaline from the bus, the anxiety about being late, the fear of this woman. It all paled in comparison to this moment. There was no hiding. The gap between their worlds had just been illuminated by a blazing searchlight. "Because I'm the night janitor in your building, Ms. Winslow," he said, his voice low and steady, though it cost him everything to keep it that way. "The 48th floor is my section. I've logged that faulty sensor 3 times. My supervisor, he just tells me to file the report and move on." A janitor. He wasn't in finance. He wasn't a consultant. He cleaned her floors. The man Clara had set her up with, the man with the kind eyes, the man Sophie called a hero, was the one who emptied her trash. The revelation was so staggering, it almost eclipsed the crisis. But the crisis was real. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a name that made her stomach clench. Jarrett, head of security. She jabbed the accept button, putting it on speaker. "What?" "Ms. Winslow, they're in." Jarrett's voice was tinny and frantic. "They're past the internal firewalls. We're locked out of the 48th floor admin controls. They're not just probing, they're targeting the Project Scion data." Margot's blood ran cold. Project Scion was everything. It was a revolutionary biotech algorithm that was poised to save her company from a hostile takeover. It was her secret weapon, her legacy, and it was about to be stolen. "The fire escape," she snapped, her eyes still on Matthew. "Did you check the fire escape access panel?" "The what?" Jarrett sounded baffled. "Ma'am, this is a sophisticated network breach. It's not physical. We're running diagnostics on the—" "You idiot." Margot's voice was a low, vicious snarl that made Matthew jump. "It is physical. They used the vulnerability on the 48th floor fire escape to plug in. That's how they bypassed the firewall. Now seal that access point. Send a team there now." "But ma'am, procedure dictates." "Procedure be damned, Jarrett. Do it." She hung up, her hands shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. Her multi-million-dollar security team was fumbling, blinded by their own protocols. The only person in this entire city who had given her actionable intelligence was the man sitting opposite her, who she'd assumed was an incompetent, disorganized deadbeat. She looked at Matthew. His face was pale but calm. He understood. He wasn't just a janitor. He was the man who saw things. The invisible man who knew her building better than anyone. She made a decision. It was insane. It was unorthodox. It was the only move she had left. "I need you to come with me," she said, her voice flat, leaving no room for argument. "Now." Matthew blinked, caught completely off guard. "Come with you? To your office?" He instinctively glanced at Sophie, who was watching the exchange with wide, curious eyes, a half-eaten breadstick in her hand. "I can't." "My daughter." "Daddy, does the lady need help?" Sophie asked, her voice small. "You're good at helping." The simple, trusting words cut through the tension. Margot looked at the little girl, and the ice in her eyes melted for just a fraction of a second. She pulled her phone back out, her thumb flying across the screen, dialing a different number. "Helen," she said, her voice changing, still firm but no longer brutal. "I have a personal emergency. I am at La Valette on 8th Street. My car is out front. I need you here in 5 minutes." She paused, listening. "You will be watching a child. Her name is Sophie. There are no other details. Just get here." She hung up before her assistant could reply. She looked at Matthew. "Helen is my executive assistant. She has watched my godson. She is bonded. Sophie will be safer with her than anyone I know. She will take her to my private penthouse suite in the building. There are movies. There is ice cream. She will be fine." Matthew's mind was reeling. A penthouse. An executive assistant. A high-stakes security breach. This was not his life. His life was squeaking carts and the smell of disinfectant. But he looked at Margot's face, the desperate, raw panic behind the CEO mask, and he saw a woman who was terrified of losing everything. And he knew how that felt. He knelt beside his daughter's chair, taking her small hands in his. "Hey, Peanut," he said softly, forcing a calm he did not feel. "I have to go help Miss Winslow with a big problem at her office. It's like a really tricky puzzle. And this nice lady, Helen, is going to come and take you on a special adventure, okay? You get to see where Miss Winslow lives, and it's way up high in the sky." Sophie's eyes widened. "Like an airplane?" "Even higher," Matthew said, managing a weak smile. "You be good. I will be there as soon as I can, I promise." "Okay, Daddy." She trusted him. Completely. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb outside. A woman in a sharp suit jumped out, her eyes scanning the restaurant, landing on Margot. Margot stood, throwing a handful of $100 bills onto the table, far more than enough to cover the water and the breadsticks. "Let's go, Mr. Stone." Matthew gave Sophie one last squeeze, his heart breaking at having to leave her, and stood. He followed Margot out of the restaurant. the warm chatter and clinking glasses fading behind them. The maitre d' watched, utterly baffled, as the woman who commanded half the city's wealth strode out into the night, followed closely by the disheveled man and his child who had arrived only minutes before. They didn't speak as they slid into the plush leather-back seat of the waiting car. The driver, separated by a glass partition, pulled into traffic. The blind date was over. But as the city lights blurred past them, painting streaks of red and gold across Margot's tense, pale face, Matthew realized that something far more complex and far more dangerous had just begun. The ride to the Winslow Investments building was a blur of silence and flashing lights. The glass partition between them and the driver ensured absolute privacy, but the air inside the car was so thick with tension it was hard to breathe. Matthew sat stiffly on the plush leather, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. His mind was a frantic split screen. One half replayed the image of Sophie's small, trusting face as she was led away by a stranger. The other half tried to process the sheer insanity of sitting next to the CEO who owned the building he cleaned. Margot was a different person entirely from the one at the restaurant. The vulnerable woman who had cried was gone, replaced by a field marshal commanding a war. Her phone was a permanent extension of her hand, her voice a low, clipped weapon. "Lock down all offshore servers, every single one," she ordered, "and get me a manual diagnostic on the 48th floor power grid. I want to know if they tap the hard lines. No, I don't care what time it is in Singapore, wake him up." She snapped the phone shut and turned to Matthew, the car's interior lights casting sharp shadows across her face. "Tell me again. The sensor." "It's the pressure sensor on the fire escape door, 48th floor, east wing," Matthew said, his voice quiet but clear. "It's supposed to log an alert if the door is opened, obviously, but it also cross-checks with the external access panel. The panel? It's finicky. The connection is loose. I've seen it flicker." "Flicker how?" "Like a power dip. It goes offline, then comes back. But it's not logging the offline status. It just pauses. I reported it because I was worried about a fire, not a this." Margot nodded, processing. "A blind spot, a 3-minute window. Or less. Long enough to plug in a drive and bypass the internal network." The car slid to a stop, not at the grand marble-floored main entrance, but at a discreet, unmarked steel door in the building's side alley. A place Matthew had never seen. Margot swiped a black, featureless card, and the door clicked open. "We're not going to the lobby," she said, stating the obvious. They bypassed the service elevators Matthew used every night and entered a private, high-speed lift paneled in dark, polished wood. Margot used the same black card, then pressed her thumb to a biometric scanner. The elevator shot upwards, the silence absolute. Matthew swallowed hard, his ears popping. He felt like a ghost, haunting a part of the building he had no right to be in. The doors opened not onto a plush office, but into a humming, brightly lit command center. The building's core security hub. It was chaos. Men and women in dark blue uniforms rushed between terminals, their voices overlapping in a babble of panicked jargon. "We have anomalous traffic on sub-level 3. The 48th floor is still not responding to remote reboot. Where is that power grid diagnostic?" A man with a flushed face and a loosened tie spotted Margot and hurried over. He had Jarrett on a name tag. "Ms. Winslow, thank God. We have a full-scale assault. They're good. They're inside our core, and we can't—" He stopped, his eyes landing on Matthew. He looked at Matthew's worn jacket, his jeans, his utter lack of belonging. "This is a restricted area, ma'am." "Who is this?" "This is Mr. Stone," Margot said, her voice cutting through the noise. The room quieted instantly. "He's with me, and he knows something you don't. Jarrett, show me the feed for the 48th floor fire escape, the external panel." Jarrett looked completely bewildered. The fire escape? "Ms. Winslow, this is a network breach. It's not a B&E. The door logs are all green, see?" He gestured to a large monitor. "Everything is secure. Show me the live feed," Margot commanded. Jarrett, grumbling, typed a command. A grainy black-and-white image of the fire escape door appeared on a smaller screen. It was still, empty. "See, ma'am." "Nothing," Jarrett said, a note of "I told you so" in his voice. Matthew stepped forward, ignoring the security head's glare. He stared at the screen, his brow furrowing. He pointed to the small digital timestamp in the corner of the feed. "There," Matthew said. "What?" Jarrett snapped. "There's nothing there." "The timestamp," Matthew said, his voice gaining a sudden, unexpected confidence. "Watch it. 22:47:15, 22:47:16, 22:47:17, and there. It just skipped. It jumped from 17 to 19 inches. Jarrett squinted. "It's a lag, a data packet drop. It happens all." "No," Matthew said, shaking his head. "It's not a lag. It's a loop. It's a pre-recorded feed, probably only a few minutes long, running over the live one. The sensor isn't faulty. It's been deliberately compromised. They're hiding their movements. They could be out there right now, and you'd be watching a recording of an empty hallway." The entire room went silent. Jarrett's face drained of all color. He looked at the screen, then back at Matthew, his jaw slack. He knew Matthew was right. The diagnostics wouldn't flag a sensor that was still sending a green signal. They had been completely blind. Margot stared at Matthew, a new, sharp light in her eyes. The panic was still there, but it was now overlaid with a piercing, intense curiosity. The janitor who noticed a flicker was one thing. The janitor who could identify a looped security feed on site, in seconds, was something else entirely. This wasn't a lucky guess. This was expertise. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice low, meant only for him amidst the renewed chaos as Jarrett began shouting orders. "How do you know what a looped feed looks like?" Matthew's gaze met hers. He was trapped. He couldn't lie, but the truth was a door he had nailed shut 8 years ago. He gave her a fraction of it. I used to build things," he said, his voice barely audible. "Electronics. Computers. You see the patterns. The data doesn't flow right. It feels wrong." "Build things," she repeated, her eyes narrowing. She knew he was telling the truth, but she also knew it wasn't the whole truth. A man who built things was now mopping her floors. Why? The question hung in the air, a new mystery suspended beside the crisis. But they had no time. "Jarrett," Margot snapped. "Get a tactical team to that fire escape. Not security, tactical. I want them armed, and I want them there 30 seconds ago. The rest of you, kill the network to that entire wing. Not a soft reboot, a hard cut. Pull the damn plugs if you have to." She turned back to Matthew, her mind made up. "You're not a janitor tonight, Mr. Stone. You're with me. You know this building. You see the patterns. Tell me, if you were them, where would you go next?" Matthew's mind raced, not with panic, but with a cold, clear logic he hadn't accessed in years. He shut out the noise of the command center, shut out Jarrett's useless sputtering, and focused on the building. He saw it not as floors and offices, but as a living system. Veins, arteries, and a central nervous system. "If you cut the power to the 48th floor network," he said, thinking aloud, "they're trapped. Their hardline access is gone. They can't transmit. So they're stuck. We win," Jarrett said, puffing his chest out. "No," Matthew said, shaking his head. "They're not stuck. They knew you'd cut the power. This was a diversion. The 48th floor wasn't the target. It was just the door. They're not trying to get in the network. They're trying to get out." He turned and pointed not at a security monitor, but at a large framed architectural schematic of the building's core infrastructure hanging on the far wall. A map nobody ever looked at. "They're not going up. They're going down," Matthew said, his finger landing on a designation near the foundation. "Sub-level 2. The old telecom junction." Jarrett scoffed, a short barking laugh. "That's impossible. That's a dead zone. It's just storage for old furniture and HVAC equipment. The network lines there were decommissioned in 2015. It's not even on our security grid." "That's why they're there," Matthew shot back, his voice sharp, turning to face the security chief. "The lines weren't cut. They were just abandoned. They're still live. I know because I have to check the breakers down there once a month. The junction boxes are active. The lights on the old routers are blinking. It's a live, unmonitored hardline straight out of this building. It's the one place you aren't looking. The room fell silent again. Jarrett's face was a mask of disbelief and fury. He was being upstaged in his own command center by a janitor. Margot stared at Matthew, her expression unreadable. She had a choice: her $500,000-a-year security chief, or the man who had been right about everything else tonight. It wasn't a choice. "Jarrett," she snapped, "you take your tactical team to the 48th floor. Sweep every office. Find that physical drive. Find anything they left behind. Now." "Yes, ma'am," Jarrett said, relieved to have a "But I'm not going with you," Margot continued, her voice pure ice. "Mr. Stone and I are going to sub-level too." "What?" Jarrett exploded. "Ma'am, absolutely not. It's a procedural violation. It's an unsecured zone. I cannot let you, a civilian, him." He waved a hand dismissively at Matthew. Margot stepped so close to Jarrett, her voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "You have failed. Your protocols failed, your team failed, and you are standing in my building, blind, while my company is stolen. He is the only one here who has seen anything. So you will go to the 48th floor, and you will do your job. And we," she said, nodding to Matthew, "will go and do yours. Give him a clearance card, an all-access override." Now, Jarrett looked like he'd been slapped, but he saw the look in her eyes. Without a word, he yanked his own master access card from his belt and slammed it onto the console in front of Matthew. "You're responsible for her," he spat at him. "I know," Matthew said quietly, picking up the card. Margot turned and walked toward the private elevator. "Let's go, Matthew." He registered the shift. Mr. Stone was gone. It was Matthew. He followed her, the weight of the override card heavy in his hand. The elevator doors closed, encasing them in the same tense silence as the car ride. This time, it was different. They were no longer CEO and janitor. They were two people walking into a trap. Margot watched him, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed in the soft light. "You built things. Electronics," she said, repeating his earlier words. "The man on the bus. Sophie said you saved his life. CPR. Matthew just nodded, his gaze fixed on the descending floor numbers. "How did you know what to do?" she pressed. I knew what to do." "That's not an answer," she said. She wasn't angry. She was curious. Utterly, intensely curious. "The way you diagnose that feed. The way you're mapping the building. You don't talk like a janitor. You don't think like one. What aren't you telling me, Matthew?" The elevator chimed and the doors slid open, saving him from having to answer. The air that hit them was a shock. Where the command center was cold and sterile, this was warm, damp, and smelled of dust, oil, and ozone. The sub-level was a cavernous space, a maze of massive concrete pillars and humming machinery. Thick pipes and bundles of cables snaked across the low ceiling. It was Matthew's world. The power dynamic shifted instantly. Here, she was the civilian. "This way," Matthew said, his voice now confident, taking the lead. He navigated the labyrinth of corridors with an easy, practiced familiarity. The air thrummed with the low-frequency hum of the building's core power. "The junction room is just ahead," he said, keeping his voice low. "It's behind a reinforced maintenance panel. It's supposed to be locked." They turned a corner into a darker, narrower corridor, lined with massive, silent HVAC units. At the very end, a standard-issue gray metal door. Matthew held up a hand, signaling her to stop. He moved forward alone, his worn work boots silent on the concrete. He didn't try the handle. He didn't use the card. He just put his ear against the cold steel. He stood there for a full 10 seconds. The only sound was the omnipresent hum. Then, beneath it, he caught it. A faint, irregular sound. Click, click, click. Pause. Click, click, click. It wasn't machinery. It was methodical. It was human. It was the sound of someone typing on a laptop keyboard. Matthew went rigid. He turned slowly, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confirmation, and met Margot's gaze. He brought a single finger to his lips, his expression saying everything. They weren't just in the right place. They were seconds too late. The person was inside, and they were already transmitting. Margot's eyes widened, her entire body tensing. Her first instinct was to lunge for the handle, to use the override card Jarrett had given him and storm the room. This was her company, her life's work, being siphoned away through a dusty, forgotten wire. She took a step forward. Matthew's hand shot out, not touching her, but barring her path. He shook his head, a single, sharp motion. His eyes were wide, urgent. He put his mouth right next to her ear, his whisper so quiet it was barely a vibration. "Steel door, reinforced frame, deadbolt from the inside. We'll never get it open in time. They'll hear us coming, wipe the drive, and be gone before we're through." "Gone where?" she whispered back, her voice shaking with repressed fury. "There's no other way out." A flicker of a smile, cold and grim, touched Matthew's lips. "There's always another way out. Ventilation shafts, a service tunnel under the slab. They planned this, but they didn't plan for me." He didn't wait for a reply. He grabbed her by the sleeve, his grip surprisingly strong, and pulled her back the way they came, out of the narrow corridor and into the main sub-level chamber. He moved with a speed and confidence that left her no choice but to follow. The sound of the desperate, rapid typing echoed in her mind. They were losing. "What are you doing?" she hissed, stumbling to keep up as he navigated the maze of machinery. "We're just letting them go." "We can't stop the door, but we can stop the power," he said, his voice clipped and focused. He wasn't talking like a janitor. He was talking like a tactician. "The junction room is on an independent circuit. It was part of the original 1980s telecom install. It's not tied to the main grid you cut." "How do you know that?" "Because," he said, skidding to a halt in front of a large, rusted-shut metal cabinet bolted to a concrete pillar. "I'm the one who resets the breaker when the lights flicker." He pulled a ring of keys from his pocket. Not the master access card, but his own, worn janitor's set. He found a small, old-fashioned brass key, jammed it into the heavy lock, and put his shoulder into it. With a groan of protesting metal, the cabinet door swung open. Margot stared. It wasn't a simple breaker box. It was a terrifying, archaic web of thick, bundled cables, analog dials, and massive, fist-sized ceramic fuses. It looked like something from a pre-war submarine. We cut the power to half the building," Margot said, her hand flying to her phone. "I have to warn." "No," Matthews said, his hand already deep inside the tangle, tracing a thick, black-sheathed cable. "Not all of it. Just this one." His fingers found a single, massive, black lever, separate from the others, coated in dust. "This is the primary feed for the 1980s lines. They thought it was decommissioned. They thought it was safe, but it's not. It's just old." He looked at her, his eyes clear and intense in the dim light. "Get ready." He braced himself and threw his entire weight against the lever. There was a deafening clack-thunk, a shower of sparks, and the deep, omnipresent hum of the sub-level machinery died instantly. The world plunged into a sudden, shocking silence. The only light came from the emergency exit signs at the far end of the chamber, casting a sickly green glow over everything. The silence lasted for 1, 2, 3 seconds. Then, from the corridor they had just left, came a muffled, furious shout. A thud as a shoulder hit the inside of the steel door. Then another, and another, a frantic, desperate pounding. The typing had stopped. Matthew let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, his body trembling from the adrenaline. He turned to Margot. She was leaning against a pillar, her phone already to her ear, the screen illuminating her face. Her expression was no longer one of panic. It was a cold, triumphant fury. "Jarrett," she said, her voice echoing in the dead silence. "Send your tactical team to sub-level 2, maintenance corridor 4 Delta, the junction room. The door is locked from the inside. Our problem," she paused, a predatory smile touching her lips, "is in there, and they're not going anywhere." She hung up and looked at Matthew, really looked at him. He stood by the open power cabinet, illuminated in the green emergency light, his chest heaving, his hands black with grease and dust. He was a janitor. He had just saved her company, He had done what her entire security division, with its millions in budget, could not. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Flash blights! The word was a brutal shout. The sublevel was instantly flooded with blinding white light. A dozen men in full black tactical gear, armed and masked, swarmed the corridor, their weapons trained on the junction room door. Jarrett stumbled in behind them, his face purple. "Door is barricaded," one of them yelled. "Get the ram! Now! Crack!" The hinges screamed. "Crack!" The frame buckled. With a final, shattering groan, the door flew open, torn from its hinges. The tactical team poured inside, their lights cutting through the darkness. "On the ground! On the ground! Now! Show me your hands!" There was a scuffle, a single, desperate grunt, and then silence. "Target acquired! One male in custody." A moment later, two of the officers hauled a man out. He was dressed in a dark, high-tech athletic suit, his face covered in sweat and grime. As they dragged him past, the man lifted his head, his eyes wild, and he locked onto Margot. Margot's blood turned to ice. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a professional thief. It was Kieran Vance, her protégé, the 28-year-old VP of analytics she'd been mentoring, the one she'd handpicked from MIT, the one she'd trusted with the core data for Project Scion. "Kieran," she whispered, the name a pained, disbelieving breath. His face, so young and brilliant, contorted into a mask of pure, venomous hatred. "You stole it from me," he shrieked, struggling against the officer's grip. "It was my algorithm. Project Scion was mine. You just put your name on it. You were never going to let me have it." That's not true, Kieran," Margot stammered, the betrayal hitting her harder than the security breach itself. "Liar," he spat. "You're a liar and a thief." "I was just taking back what was mine." "Get him out of here," Jarrett ordered, his voice shaking, finally seeing the scope of his own failure. He had been looking for foreign hackers, while the traitor was walking the halls right next to him. As Kieran was dragged away, his curses echoing down the corridor, the adrenaline that had held the night together evaporated, leaving a cold, sick vacuum. Margot leaned against the concrete pillar, her legs suddenly weak. The crisis was over. Her company was safe. But she felt shattered. She looked at Matthew, who had watched the entire ugly scene with a quiet, sad detachment. "How?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. "How did you know?" "The looped feed, the junction box, the patterns. You build things?" Matthew looked down at his own hands, black with grease and dust. He couldn't tell her. He couldn't open that door. Not here, not now. "I told you," he said, his voice low. "I see things people miss. It's just what I do." He looked past her, toward the elevator, his mind shifting from the corporate war to the one thing that mattered. "I need to get to my daughter." Margot stared at him. It wasn't an answer. It was another, deeper mystery. But he was right. The night wasn't over. Not yet. She pushed herself off the wall, the CEO mask sliding back into place. But her eyes, when they looked at him, were full of a million new, unanswered questions. The tactical team was securing the junction room, barking code words into their radios. The noise was jarring, an invasion of the building's deep silence. Jarrett, his face pale and slick with sweat, was trying to give orders, but everyone was ignoring him. They were all looking at Margot, and Margot was only looking at Matthew. "I need to get to my daughter," he repeated, his voice firm, cutting through the operational chaos. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only a cold, hollow exhaustion and the single, burning need to see his child. Margot held his gaze for a long, unblinking moment. The questions were still there, hanging in the air, but she saw the iron resolve in his eyes. He was done. She nodded, a single, sharp motion. "Secure the scene, Jarrett," she commanded, her voice ringing with its old authority. "I want a full diagnostic on every byte of data Kieran accessed. I want a list of every person he's spoken to in the last 6 months. Handle it." She turned and walked to the private elevator, not waiting for a reply. Matthew followed. The steel doors slid shut, encasing them in polished wood and silence once more. The elevator began its smooth, silent ascent, lifting them from the building's grimy, secret foundation. They stood on opposite sides of the small space, not touching, but the air between them was electric, humming with everything unsaid. "He was my protégé," Margot said, her voice small, speaking to the wall. "I was going to give him the company, eventually. I trusted him." "I'm sorry," Matthew said, and he meant it. "You never answered my question," she said, turning to face him. The elevator was still rising, a silent, moving box. "Not really. You see things. That's not an answer. The man on the bus. Sophie said you saved his life. CPR. You knew exactly what to do. You knew what a looped feed looked like. You mapped the building's infrastructure from a schematic. You knew how to kill the power. You don't just see things, Matthew. That's expertise. It's training." She took a step closer. "Who are you?" Matthew leaned his head back against the polished wood. He was so tired. Tired of the night. Tired of the questions, but mostly tired of the lie. The quiet, invisible life he had built was a fortress, but it was also a prison. And this woman, she had, in her own broken way, seen him. He met her gaze. "I was a surgeon," he said. The words dropped into the silence, as loud and definitive as the breaker switch he had just thrown. Margot's eyes widened. She just stared, her mind visibly processing the word. Surgeon. It was the key, the one piece that made all the others fit. A surgeon? Like a doctor? "A cardiothoracic resident," he clarified, his voice hollow. "A heart surgeon. The man on the bus." She breathed. "I knew what to do," he nodded. "The patterns, the diagnostics. The human body, a building's network. They're just systems," he said. "You learn to see the anomalies, the rhythms that are wrong." The elevator chimed, but neither of them moved. The doors hadn't opened. Margot was still processing. "You were," she said, seizing on the word. "You're a janitor." "Why? How?" "My wife, Anne," he said, the name feeling like rust in his mouth. "She died 8 years ago." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, he saw the shared, unspoken number connect them. 8 years. The same chasm of time. "It was childbirth," he whispered, the confession torn from him. "Sophie was born, and Anne, she had an embolism. It was fast. We were in the same hospital where I worked. I was right there. I had colleagues, the best. But there was nothing. I held my daughter in one arm, and I lost." He didn't need to finish. Margot felt her own breath hitch, the phantom ache of her own empty arms, the sterile white room, the deafening silence. "After that," Matthew continued, his voice hollow, I couldn't go back in. The smell of the antiseptic, the sound of the monitors. I couldn't hold a scalpel. I couldn't be God. I couldn't even save her. So I walked away. I took the one job where I could be invisible, where I could just clean up, where I could be there for Sophie. No one asks questions of a janitor. 8 years, Margot whispered, her own voice cracking, the CEO mask completely gone. I lost my daughter, Emily, 8 years ago too. The same week my company launched." Her hand went to her mouth, her eyes flooding. I never even got to bring her home." The truth landed between them, a heavy, invisible weight. Sophie's words at the restaurant. "My mommy became an angel. She has the prettiest eyes, just like yours." "That's," Matthew breathed, the realization dawning. "That's why you cried." When she said, She saw it," Margot whispered, tears now streaming freely. I thought she was a sweet kid, but she knew." The elevator chimed again, and this time, the doors slid open. The sub-level was gone. They were in a space that was the complete opposite. It wasn't an office. It was a home. A sprawling penthouse, all warm woods, soft lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed the entire city glittering like a carpet of diamonds below. And on a plush, oversized sofa, curled up under a cashmere throw, was Sophie. She was fast asleep, her breathing soft and even. Sitting in a chair beside her, a book in her lap, was the sharp-suited woman from the restaurant, Helen, who looked up and smiled in relief. Matthew didn't even see the view. He didn't see the art on the walls or the expensive furniture. He crossed the vast room in 3 strides and knelt by the couch, his hand gently touching Sophie's hair, his shoulders slumping as the last of the night's terror finally left him. She was safe. Helen stood quietly. She was a perfect angel, Miss Winslow. Warmed up as soon as she saw the Cars movie poster. She fell asleep about an hour ago. "Thank you, Helen," Margot said, her voice still thick with emotion. I know this was not in your job description. You can go home, take the morning off." "That's not necessary, ma'am." "But thank you." Helen gathered her purse, gave Matthew a small, respectful nod, and let herself out of the penthouse, the heavy door clicking shut with a sound of expensive, insulated finality. They were alone. The silence of the penthouse was louder than the sub-level's alarms. Below them, the city was a silent, glittering map. Matthew stood, frozen, just watching his daughter breathe. He bent down, his movements careful, and began to slide his arms under Sophie, intending to lift her. "Wait." He paused, his hand still on his daughter. He looked back at Margot. She was standing by the window, her silhouette framed against the skyline. The armor was gone. She looked exhausted, fragile, and utterly lost. "What you did tonight," she began, her voice rough. "Thank you it's not enough." "It's ridiculous." Matthew straightened up, letting Sophie sleep. "You don't have to say anything. I'm just glad it's over." He was Kieran. She shook her head, as if to clear it. "I was going to give him everything?" The betrayal was a fresh wound, and seeing it made Matthew's own, older scars ache in sympathy. "I'm sorry," he said again. "A heart surgeon," she whispered, as if still testing the fact. "And you're cleaning my floors." It's an honest job," he said, his voice quiet. "It lets me be there. I get home before she wakes up. I take her to school. That's all that matters." "That's not what I meant," she said. She looked from him to the small sleeping child on her couch. The two of them, a complete, self-contained world. She looked around her own vast, empty, silent home. Her castle. Matthew cleared his throat, the moment stretching. I should get her home. It's so late." "Home?" Margot said, blinking. How are you getting home?" "The buses." "We'll get a cab," he said, already moving, desperate to be back in his own world, where things made sense. "No," Margot said, her voice regaining a fraction of its command. "Don't be ridiculous. My driver is downstairs. He'll take you." You don't have to do that, Miss Winslow." "Margot," she corrected him, her voice firm. "My name is Margot." "And I'm not. It's not a request." She grabbed her phone. "He'll take you to your door." The elevator ride down was silent, but it was a different silence. Not the tension of the crisis, but the heavy, fragile silence of two people who had seen each other's deepest wounds. The driver was waiting by the black car, the door already open. He didn't blink as Matthew, in his worn jacket and holding a sleepy child, climbed into the plush back seat. Matthew looked out the window at Margot. She stood on the curb, the massive, empty glass lobby of her building behind her. She wasn't a CEO. She was just a woman, standing alone in the middle of the night. "Margot," he said, the name feeling strange. I should go. I need to get her home." She met his gaze, her own eyes reflecting the streetlights. The CEO mask was gone, leaving just the woman who had cried in the restaurant. "Yes," she said. "You should." The silence stretched, full of the night's revelations and everything still unsaid. "Good night, Matthew," she said softly. "Good night." Margot. The door closed and the car pulled away, sinking into the quiet, pre-dawn streets. Matthew watched in the side mirror as Margot Winslow, millionaire, CEO, and the loneliest woman he had ever met, turned and walked back into her empty, silent building, all alone. The black car moved silently through the sleeping city, a high-tech cocoon separating Matthew from the world. Sophie was a warm, heavy weight against his chest, her breath fogging the window. He watched the familiar gritty streets of his own neighborhood slide by. The closed bodega, the laundromat with a flickering neon sign, the walk-up apartments stacked one on top of the other. It was a million miles from the glass and steel castle they had just left. The driver, a true professional, didn't say a word as he pulled up to Matthew's modest apartment building. He got out and opened the door for them, his face impassive, as if he chauffeured janitors and their sleeping children home from corporate crises every night. "Thank you," Matthew murmured, sliding out, careful not to wake Sophie. The man just nodded, got back in the car, and the black sedan disappeared around the corner, as silent as a ghost. Matthew stood on the cracked pavement for a moment, the keys to his own building feeling heavy and real in his hand. The air smelled like damp pavement and the faintest hint of exhaust. It smelled like home. Inside, his small apartment was warm and cluttered. Sophie's toys were in a basket by the sofa, her drawings taped to the refrigerator. It was a life, not a showcase. He carried her straight to her bedroom, which was painted a bright, cheerful yellow, and tucked her into her small bed. She didn't even stir, just burrowed deeper under her cartoon character comforter. He stood and watched her, his heart a painful, aching knot in his chest. I almost didn't go home tonight. The thought was cold, sharp. He left her door ajar and walked into his own kitchen, the adrenaline finally draining, leaving him hollow. He saw his own worn face in the dark reflection of the window above the sink. A surgeon. He hadn't said that word, hadn't thought it with any real meaning, in 8 years. It felt like describing a character in a book he'd once read. He couldn't sleep. He sat on his lumpy sofa, the one with a slightly frayed arm, and the night replayed in his head. But it wasn't the tactical team or the sparks from the breaker that he saw. It was Margot, her hand flying to her mouth as Sophie whispered in her ear, her raw, disbelieving pain when she recognized Kieran, and her face, utterly shattered, when she'd whispered, "I never even got to bring her home." He had spent 8 years building a quiet, invisible life to contain his own grief. Tonight, he had stumbled directly into hers, and he had found, to his shock, that it was a perfect mirror. Far across the city, Margot stood in her glass-walled shower, the water scalding hot, but she couldn't feel it. She was trying to wash the night away, the dust of the sub-level, the grime of the betrayal, the lingering scent of old machinery. But it was all inside her. When she stepped out, the penthouse was utterly silent. The sun was just beginning to stain the eastern sky a pale, sickly gray. Her home, her castle, had never felt more like a cage. She walked barefoot across the cold marble floor, her robe trailing behind her, and stood where Sophie had been sleeping. She could almost see the small indentation on the cashmere throw. She had saved her company. She had won. But she felt empty. She thought of Matthew, a heart surgeon, a man who had held the power of life and death in his hands, who had walked away from it all to, what? To be present, to take his daughter to school, to make sure he was home when she woke up. It was a choice so fundamentally opposite to every decision she had ever made. She had buried her grief for her daughter under 80-hour work weeks. She had built an empire to insulate herself from the very pain that Matthew had chosen to live inside day after day. His quiet, determined sacrifice made her entire life's work feel hollow, brittle. She looked at her phone. The screen was already lighting up. Her board of directors, her PR chief, her legal team. The world was waking up, and it demanded its CEO. She took a deep breath, and the mask slid back into place. The vulnerable woman was gone. Margot Winslow, cool and in command, went to get dressed for war. The next day was a blur for Matthew. He got 3 hours of restless, nightmarish sleep. He woke up, made Sophie pancakes, and walked her to school, his hand clasped tightly in hers. The other parents in the schoolyard looked the same. The crossing guard told the same bad jokes. Everything was normal, but he felt like a spy. He went home, paid some bills, and was trying to nap when his phone buzzed. An unknown number. His heart hammered. He answered, his voice thick with sleep. "Hello?" "Mr. Stone, Matthew, it's Margot Winslow." He sat bolt upright on the sofa, instantly awake. "Margot, Miss Winslow, hi. I apologize for calling you at home. I got your number from Clara's file on our date." She sounded formal. The CEO was back. "I'm sure you understand. There are administrative matters to discuss." "Right, of course," he said, rubbing his face. "First, Jarrett has been retired. The report on last night's incident credits an anonymous third-party security consultant with the assist. Your name is not in it. Your job is safe, if you still want it." He felt a wave of relief. "Yes, I still want it. I need it. Thank you." There was a pause. He heard her take a breath. "That's the second thing. I cannot, in good conscience, allow you to keep that job." His stomach dropped. "What? You just said—" "No, not like that," she said, quickly. "I mean, you saved my company, Matthew. You were a surgeon. The idea of you pushing a mop on the 48th floor tonight, it's unacceptable." "It's my job," he said, his voice hardening. "It's not the right job," she countered, her CEO instincts, her need to fix, to control, taking over. "I'm creating a new position. Head of Operations and Security Oversight. You'd report directly to me. You know the building better than anyone. You see the patterns. It's a 6-figure position, Matthew. With bonuses, you can give your daughter everything." It was the offer. The golden ticket. The life-changing sum that would move him and Sophie out of this small apartment. The end of worrying about the gas bill, about everything. He saw the entire future flash before his eyes. The long hours, the endless meetings, the phone calls at 3 a.m. that weren't about a security breach, but a power outage on the 12th floor. He'd be trading his janitor's uniform for a suit, but it was just another uniform. He shook his head, slowly, though she couldn't see him. No. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. He could picture her, frozen in her glass office. What do you mean, no?" she finally asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and confusion. "I can't take that job, Margot," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I'm flattered. I am. But I told you why I left my first career. It wasn't just the hospital. It was the life. It was the 80-hour weeks. It was the missed dinners. It was the exhaustion. It cost everything." He stood up, walking to his small kitchen window, looking down at the street. "This job, my job, it lets me be there. I make Sophie breakfast. I walk her to school. I'm at the gate when she gets out. She's never with a sitter for more than a few hours. I read her a story. I kiss her goodnight, and then I go to work." He took a deep breath. "That job you're offering, that's a daytime job. That's a life job. That's the one thing I can't give you. I will not trade my time with her. Not for any salary. I'm sorry." Margot was floored, utterly, completely silenced. He had just refused a fortune. He had refused to be saved. He had chosen this life, not because he was broken, but because he was whole. He had chosen it for his daughter. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her fix, her CEO solution, was an insult. She had tried to buy him, to solve the problem of him with a check, and he had just gently, firmly told her that his life was not a problem to be solved. She started, her voice sounding strange, smaller. See, I didn't think of it that way. Most people wouldn't," he said, not unkindly. "So," she said, the awkwardness a vast canyon between them. You'll be in tonight? To work?" "Yes," he said. "It's my shift. The floors don't clean themselves." "Right." He heard her exhale. "Right. Well, I'll see you, Matthew. Good night, Margot." He hung up the phone and stood there, his heart pounding. He had just said no to a new life. He looked around his small, cramped, perfect apartment. He had said yes to his real one. Matthew got through the rest of the day in a haze. He made Sophie dinner. They did her spelling homework. and he read her a story about a dragon who was afraid of heights. She was giggling, warm and safe in her bed, and as he kissed her forehead, the weight of his decision settled on him. He had chosen this moment. This was real. The six-figure salary, the corner office, it was all just noise. He went to his shift with a strange, new quiet in his heart. The dread was gone, replaced by a simple, weary certainty. He had said his piece. He had refused the job. Now they would either fire him or they would let him be. Either way, the pretending was over. He punched his time card at 9:02 p.m. The new head of security, a stern woman named Albers who had replaced Jarrett, just nodded at him, her eyes sharp but professional. The building's atmosphere was tense, the staff all on edge after the high-level firing. But no one looked at him twice. He was, once again, invisible. He started his route. 45th floor, 46th, 47th. His movements were automatic. His cart squeaked. Everything was the same. Then he got to the 48th floor. He pushed his cart out of the elevator. The long, dark corridor was empty, just as it always was. He started his routine, his mind oddly calm. He'd clean the floors, empty the trash, and go home. He reached Margot's main office. The large glass doors were closed. The light was on. He froze. His heart, which had been so steady, gave a single, painful thump. She was there. She was waiting for him, or she was just working late. It didn't matter. He had to go in. He took a deep breath, parked his cart, and picked up the small metal trash bin. He pushed the glass door open. She was at her desk, not working, just sitting there, staring out at the glittering city lights. She wasn't in a suit. She was wearing dark trousers and a simple, soft-looking cashmere sweater. She turned her head as he entered. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. He avoided her gaze, walked silently to the small trash bin beside her desk, and knelt to empty it into his larger one. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rustle of paper. "I embarrassed you," she said. Her voice, quiet in the vast, empty room, made him pause. He stopped, still kneeling, his back to her. "No," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Don't," she said. "Please, the phone call, the job offer, it was crass, insensitive. I was trying to quantify what you did, to put a price on it." He slowly stood up, placing the empty bin back. He turned to face her. "It was a generous offer, Margot. Just not the right one for me. We're clear." She looked down at her hands, which were clasped on the polished desk. "It wasn't a generous offer," she said, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "It was my only way of knowing how to say thank you, by trying to fix what I thought was broken. It's what I do. It's all I know how to do." "I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air. It was real. There was no CEO in it. It was just a woman, admitting she was wrong. The last of his defensiveness melted away. "Apology accepted," Matthew said quietly. He turned to leave, his job in her office finished. "Matthew." He stopped at the door, his hand on the frame. "Clara," she said, her voice stronger. Our friend, the barista, when she set us up on that date, she thought we were just two lonely people." He turned back. The light from the city framed her, making her look small against the vast, dark skyline. "We are, aren't we?" he said. A small, sad smile touched her lips. I don't want to be. Not anymore." This was new. This wasn't about the company, or the job, or the breach. This was the conversation they were supposed to have. At the restaurant, before their worlds had collided. Before he could process it, she stood up. "Sophie, does she like parks? With ducks?" Matthew blinked, completely blindsided by the change of topic. Yes, she loves them." "Why?" "St. James Park," Margot said, not as a question. "Clara mentioned it. You go there, Saturdays." "Usually, yeah," he said, his heart starting to pound again, but for a different reason. She walked out from behind the massive, intimidating desk, stopping a few feet from him. She wasn't his boss. He wasn't her janitor. They were just a man and a woman in a dark, quiet room. "Saturday," she said. 10 o'clock. I'd like to see the ducks, and I'd like to talk." As the two lonely people Clara thought she was setting up, no job offers, no security, no Ms. Winslow. Just Margot. He stared at her. She was terrified. He could see it in the tightness of her posture, the way she held her hands. The most powerful woman he'd ever met was asking him, the janitor, out, not as a boss, but as a woman. He thought about his small apartment, his lumpy sofa. He thought about her in this vast, empty castle, night after night. I don't know what to say," he said honestly. "You don't have to say anything," she said, a small, fragile smile appearing. "Just, if you're there, I'll be there. And if you're not, I'll understand." She had given him the choice, the power. She had offered him a way out, and he had refused. Now she was offering him a way in, and the choice was, once again, entirely his. "Good night, Matthew," she said softly. "Good night, Margot," he replied. He backed out of the office, pulling his cart with him. He didn't clean the rest of the 48th floor. He pushed his cart straight to the service elevator, his mind reeling. He went home, the scent of her office, a faint, expensive smell of paper and something floral, lingering in his senses. He had just been invited on a date, a real one, by the CEO of his company, and he had no idea if he was going to go. The rest of the week was a special kind of torture. Matthew lived his two lives, but now they were bleeding into each other, creating a disorienting, murky gray. By day, he was Dad. He made sandwiches. He refereed a dispute over a red crayon. He listened to Sophie practice her one line as a tree in the upcoming school play. "I am a tree," with a seriousness that was both hilarious and heartbreaking. But his mind was on the 48th floor. By night, he was the janitor, but he was no longer invisible. He was acutely aware of every security camera, every late-working executive. He was a man with a secret. He was the man who had been in the sub-level. He was the man who had been invited to the park by the CEO. On Thursday night, the conflict came to a head. He was doing his 11 p.m. sweep of the executive lounge on the 45th floor, a room with plush carpets and a billion-dollar view. 3 board members, men he'd only ever seen as names on office doors, were finishing a late meeting, tumblers of whiskey in their hands. Matthew entered silently, as he was trained, moving to the waste bins. They didn't even look up. "The breach was a disaster," one of them said, his voice a low growl. "Jarrett was an idiot, but this is a mess." Margot's rattled. "She handled it," another said. "The consultant she brought in, very hush-hush. Whoever he was, he plugged the hole." The first man scoffed. "She's lucky, but this proves she's spread too thin. She's emotional. Ever since the Kieran Vance thing, she's not the same." "She's a woman," the third man said, swirling his glass. "They get sentimental. She needs a strong second-in-command. Someone to handle the unpleasantries." They didn't see Matthew. He was just a function. A pair of hands emptying a bin. He backed out of the room, his face burning with a cold, quiet rage. They get sentimental. They spoke about her as if she were a faulty piece of equipment. They had no idea. They saw the castle, but they didn't see the woman inside. He pushed his cart through the silent, empty halls, his decision made. He couldn't go to the park. It was impossible. He wasn't just in a different tax bracket. He was from a different species. He was the help. Any attempt to bridge that gap would be a fantasy. It would be a disaster for him. And he realized it would be dangerous for her. If those men, those corporate sharks, ever got a hint that she was meeting her janitor in the park, they would tear her apart. They would call her emotional and sentimental, and they would use it to take her company. He wouldn't do that to her. He wouldn't be the weapon they used against her. He finished his shift, the decision a heavy, cold stone in his gut. He would not go. Friday afternoon, he was on the floor of his living room, helping Sophie paint a shoebox for a school project. The apartment was filled with the smell of tempera paint and the sound of Sophie humming. "Daddy?" she said, not looking up from her very green box. "Yeah, Peanut? Is the castle lady sad?" Matthew's hand stilled, a blue paint-covered brush hovering over the newspaper. He remembered her face in the office, her small voice. "I don't want to be. Not anymore. Yeah, Peanut. I think she is," he said quietly. "Oh." Sophie dipped her brush in the green. "Then she needs a friend." She said it so simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. It's not that simple, honey." Matthew sighed, starting to paint a cloud. "Yes, it is," Sophie insisted, pausing to look at him, her eyes wide and serious, a small smudge of green on her nose. "You're sad sometimes. About Mommy, and I'm your friend, and I make you laugh. She's just sad in her castle. She needs a friend to make her laugh. We should show her Sir Quaxley. He's sad too, 'cause he only has one eye. But he's the best." Matthew stopped. He stared at his daughter. "It's not that simple." But what if it was? The board members, the money, the power, the class divide. All of it was real. All of it was a mountain. But Sophie, she just saw a sad lady who needed a friend. He had spent the last 8 years of his life building a fortress to protect himself and his daughter. He had turned down a fortune to protect his time with her. He had based his entire world on a single, powerful truth. Sophie comes first. And now Sophie, in her simple, profound wisdom, was telling him to go. Not for a future, not for a romance, but for a reason he couldn't argue with. Because someone was sad and they had a chance to be a friend. He looked at the green shoebox. He looked at his daughter's earnest, paint-smeared face. "You're right, Peanut," he said, his voice thick. "You're absolutely right. Sir Quaxley deserves a formal introduction. Saturday morning, 9:51 a.m. The sky was a sharp, clear blue, the air crisp with autumn. Matthew's hands were clammy. He'd changed his shirt 3 times, finally settling on a simple, clean, dark green Henley that he hoped looked normal. Sophie was practically vibrating, skipping ahead of him on the cracked pavement, clutching a paper bag of oats. "Do you think she'll like him, Daddy? Do you think she'll know he's the king of all the ducks?" "I think she'll know right away, Peanut," Matthew said, his stomach doing a slow, nervous flip. They reached the park entrance, the familiar wrought iron gate. Matthew stopped. His breath hitched. She was there. She wasn't standing by the gate, waiting. She was sitting on a bench a little way inside, facing the pond, as if she was trying to be invisible. She was wearing dark jeans, a simple cream-colored sweater, and flat shoes. Her hair was down. She looked small. She looked like a normal person. She was just sitting there, twisting her hands in her lap, her head down, as if she was studying the ground. She looked, Matthew realized with a jolt, exactly like she was steeling herself for rejection, absolutely certain he wouldn't come. He was about to call her name, to let her know they were there. But Sophie, with the uncomplicated joy of a child, spotted her. "Castle lady!" she shrieked, her voice high and clear. Margot's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and a sudden, shocking, brilliant hope. Sophie dropped Matthew's hand and sprinted across the grass, her pigtails flying, the bag of oats clutched in her fist. You came to see the ducks." Margot went rigid, her hands flying up in a useless, defensive gesture as the small, 8-year-old human missile launched toward her. She clearly had no idea what to do. Sophie didn't care. She crashed into Margot's legs with a force that made the CEO stumble back, and she wrapped her arms around her knees in a fierce, uncompromising hug. You came! I told Daddy you would!" Sophie beamed, her face pressed against the soft material of Margot's jeans. Matthew was on his feet, rushing over, his face burning. "Sophie!" "Honey, gentle. You can't just—" "I'm so sorry, Ms. W." Margot hadn't moved. Her hands were still frozen in the air, hovering, unsure where to land. She looked at Matthew over Sophie's head, her eyes wide, a silent, "What do I do?" message in them. After a long, agonizing second, One hand, trembling slightly, came to rest on top of Sophie's head. An awkward, hesitant pat. It's okay, Margot said, her voice thin, breathless. She's strong. She's a bowling ball, Matthew said, trying to diffuse the tension. He gently unpeeled his daughter, keeping a hand on her shoulder. Peanut, you have to give people space. But I like her, Sophie said, as if it were the most logical reason in the world. She grabbed Margot's hand, her small, warm fingers lacing with the CEO's cool, long ones. Margot's hand instinctively tensed, then, just as quickly, relaxed. Come on, we have oats. You have to meet Sir Quaxley. The three of them stood at the water's edge. The tension, which had been so thick, began to dissolve in the bright morning sun and the chaotic, happy quacking of the ducks. Sophie, as the official ambassador, showed Margot the proper throwing technique. After a few awkward, stiff-arm tosses, Margot's shoulders began to relax. A small, tentative smile touched her lips as a particularly brave duckling, who Sophie immediately identified as Sir Quaxley, ate almost from her hand. When the oats were gone, Sophie ran off to the swing set, her shouts blending with the others. Margot and Matthew sat on the bench, the empty bread bag between them. You know, Margot said, her voice so quiet he almost missed it. I don't think I ever properly thanked her. Sophie, he turned to her. What for? For what she said. At the restaurant, she was staring at her hands, twisting the empty oat bag. About her mother's eyes. It was the first time I'd cried over Emily. In years. I had built such high walls. That little girl, she just walked right through them. Matthew watched a mother push a stroller past them. She does that. Anne, my wife, she was like that too. Unapologetically open. I tell Sophie stories about her all the time. I'm so afraid she'll forget her. That I'll forget the sound of her laugh. I don't have that, Margot whispered, her voice thick. I just have 48 hours. And I was on a conference call for most of it. You can't, Matthew said, his own pain rising up, sharp and familiar. You can't walk back down that hallway. It doesn't lead anywhere. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You're right. Daddy, look! I'm a bat, Sophie yelled from the swings. You're a beautiful bat, Peanut. Don't let go, he called back. Sophie giggled, then jumped down from the slowing swing and ran back to the bench. She was holding something in her fist. She ignored Matthew and climbed straight into Margot's lap, sitting down as if she'd been doing it her whole life. Margot went completely, utterly still. She looked like a statue, her hands frozen, her eyes wide with a kind of terrified reverence. These are for you, Sophie said, pushing a small, wilted bouquet of yellow dandelions into Margot's hand. They're wishes. Margot's trembling hand closed around the weeds. She looked down at the small, warm child who had so fearlessly invaded her space. She wrapped her arm around Sophie's middle, pulling her close, and buried her face for just a second in her hair, inhaling the scent of sunshine and sugar. Matthew watched, his heart so full it hurt. He didn't say anything. He just sat and let the moment be. That day in the park was the beginning. The Saturdays became Sundays too for ice cream. Then it was a rainy Tuesday, when Margot, in her jeans, showed up at their apartment with 3 large pizzas, because she was in the neighborhood. A neighborhood she had no other reason to be in. She sat on their lumpy sofa, a throw pillow from a discount store behind her, and helped Sophie with her math homework while Matthew made coffee. Their worlds, once so violently collided, began to slowly, carefully, merge. The real test came a few weeks later. It was the night of Sophie's school play. Matthew, sitting in the hot, crowded gymnasium, had his phone in his hand. Margot, something has come up, a major investor dinner. I can't make it. I'm so sorry. Tell tree number 2 to break a leg. His heart sank. He was furious with himself for being so disappointed. Of course she had a dinner. He was the janitor. She was her. He was just being stupid. She's not coming, is she, Daddy? Sophie asked, her leaf crown drooping. She's really busy, Peanut. But she said to break a leg. Oh, okay. Sophie walked backstage, her shoulders slumped. Matthew sat alone, surrounded by buzzing, proud parents, and felt a familiar, crushing loneliness. The play started. The kids were loud. Then the trees came on. Sophie was right in the middle. She found Matthew, and her smile was small, watery. She stood there, a perfect, still tree. Then it was her time. She stepped forward. "I am a tree," she whispered, her voice barely carrying. Matthew clapped so hard his hands stung. As the applause died down, the main gymnasium door at the back, a heavy metal fire door, creaked open. A slice of light cut through the dimness. A figure slipped inside, trying to be quiet, and stood in the shadows by the back wall. Matthew's heart stopped. It wasn't apparent. The silhouette was unmistakable. She was wearing a sleek, dark dress, not the jeans from the park. Her hair was up. She looked like she had just stepped out of a limousine. She had come. She had left her investor dinner. Her eyes scanned the crowd, and then they found him. Across the sea of parents, across the gymnasium, their gazes locked. Sophie, her big line over, was back in her spot, but she had seen the door open. She saw the figure, and her eyes went wide. She tugged on the sleeve of the kid next to her and pointed, her whisper carrying clear across the quiet. "It's her. It's the castle lady." When the play ended, Sophie didn't run to Matthew. She ran, her construction paper leaves flapping, straight up the aisle to the back, and launched herself into Margot's arms. Margot caught her, lifting her high, not caring about her dress or the staring parents. "You were," Margot whispered, her voice thick, "the most magnificent tree I have ever seen." The seasons turned. The dandelions in Margot's office were replaced by a framed, paint-smeared drawing of the Castle Lady and Sir Quaxley. Matthew still pushed his cart on the 48th floor, but now, sometimes, he'd find a high-end coffee pod left on his cart, and he'd leave a perfect polished apple on her desk. One crisp spring afternoon, almost a year after their date, they were at the park. It was just a normal Saturday. Sophie was at the swings. Matthew and Margot were on the bench, close now, their shoulders touching. "My board is concerned," Margot said quietly, watching Sophie. "I'm leaving at 5. I'm turning down dinners. They think I'm sentimental." Matthew tensed, the word like a slap. "I'm sorry, Margot. I told you, I'm a liability. I can just be the janitor." She turned to him, her eyes fierce. "No, you're the man who saved my company. You're the man who showed me what a home is. They're just wrong. I don't care what they think." She took his hand, the calloused janitor's hand. "I don't want to be in the castle anymore, Matthew. It's just an empty building." He looked at her, this brilliant, powerful, brave woman who was holding his hand in a public park. He thought of his small, messy apartment. "I can't give you a castle, Margot," he said, his voice thick. "I don't have stock options. I have a 2-bedroom apartment, a lumpy sofa, and a daughter who thinks you hung the moon." He reached into his pocket. He hadn't planned this, but it was the only thing that made sense. He pulled out, not a ring, but a small, worn, brass key. His own apartment key. It's all I have, but it's yours, if you want it, if you'll marry us." Margot looked at the simple, worn key in his hand. It was worth more than all the diamonds on her watch, more than all the stock in her company. It was the key to a home. She was crying. Again. But the tears were different. They weren't the tears of grief, or betrayal, or loneliness. They were, for the first time in her life, tears of simple, uncomplicated joy. "Yes," she whispered, her hand closing over his. 1,000 times, yes. The wedding was on a Saturday. It wasn't at a grand hall. It was at the park, right by the pond. There were no board members. There was just Clara, the barista, wiping her eyes. Matthew, in a simple dark suit, watched his daughter walk down the grassy aisle. Sophie, as the maid of honor, flower girl, and ring bearer all in one, was clutching a bouquet of dandelions, her face a mask of profound seriousness. And then he saw Margot. She was in a simple cream-colored dress, her hair down. She wasn't a CEO. She was just Margot. And her eyes, the eyes that Sophie had recognized from the very beginning, were fixed on him. They said their vows as the sun began to set, the words simple and real and strong. When it was over, and the three of them, Matthew, Margot, and Sophie, stood together, holding hands, the little girl looked up at them, her smile brighter than the city lights. 8 years ago, two people, on opposite sides of the city, had lost their worlds. They had locked themselves in castles of grief and anonymity. But on a rainy night, in a restaurant, a little girl had looked up, had seen an angel's eyes, and had whispered the words that brought two broken worlds together and built a new one. If you're hearing this, it means you stayed to the very end. Thank you. That honestly means the world to me. I really hope you got something out of it, maybe a new way of looking at things, a moment of peace, or just a good escape from the everyday. If you did, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. You see, we're on a mission here, to prove that deep, meaningful stories still have a place in this world. When you subscribe, it's like you're telling us, keep going. When you hit that like button, you're giving the story a little push so it can find the next person who might need it. Don't forget those notifications so you know when the next one is ready. From me to you, thank you for being here. Carry the best parts of this one with you.